Boccaccio's Decameron, second day, sixth story. The whole company, ladies and young men alike, rocked with laughter over Filometta's account of Andruccio's misfortune, and then Emilia, on seeing that the story was finished and receiving a signal from the queen, began as follows. The erratic course pursued by fortune frequently leads to pain and irritation, but since our mental faculties, which are easily lulled to sleep by her blandishments, are aroused as often as a subject is openly discussed, I consider that nobody, whether he be happy or miserable, should ever object to hearing an account of her eccentricities, in that the first man will be placed on his guard, and the second will receive some consolation. Accordingly, I propose to tell you a story no less true than touching. It's not true. On this same topic, upon which such splendid things have already been said, and whilst my tale has a happy ending, the suffering contained therein was so intense and protracted that I can scarcely believe it was entirely assuaged by the happiness that ensued. You are to know, dear ladies, that Manfred, who was crowned King of Sicily after the death of Emperor Frederick II, held few of his courtiers in higher esteem than a gentleman of Naples called Arrighetto Capice, who had a beautiful and noble wife, also Neapolitan, called Madonna Beritola Caracciolo. Arrighetto was in fact governing the island when news reached him that King Charles I had defeated and killed Manfred at Benevento, and that the whole kingdom had gone over to the conqueror. Knowing that the Sicilians could never be trusted for long, and not wishing to become a subject of his master's enemy, he prepared to flee, but his plans were discovered by the Sicilians, who promptly took him prisoner and delivered him over to King Charles, along with many other friends and servants of King Manfred. And shortly afterwards, the island itself was surrendered. In the face of all this upheaval, not knowing what had become of Arrighetto, frightened by what had happened and fearing a possible attempt on her own honor, Madonna Beritola abandoned everything she possessed, and though pregnant and reduced to poverty, she fled by ship to Lipari with her son Gisfredi, who was about 8 years old. There she gave birth to a second son, whom she called the Outcast. And having hired a nurse, she embarked with all three on a tiny ship bound for Naples, with the intention of rejoining her family. But her plans misfired, for the ship was driven by strong winds to the island of Ponza, where they put into a little bay and began to wait more favorable weather for their voyage. Like the others, Madonna Beritola went ashore there, and she sought out a deserted and remote spot on the island where, in complete solitude, she could give vent to her sorrow for the loss of her husband. This became a daily ritual of hers, until one day, as she was busy sorrowing, it happened that a pirate galley arrived, taking the crew and everyone else unawares, and departed again after capturing the ship and all hands. Having completed her daily lament, Madonna Beritola, following her usual practice, returned to the shore to look for her children. On finding nobody in sight, she was at first perplexed, and then, suddenly suspecting what had happened, she cast her eyes seawards and saw the galley, not yet very far distant, with the little ship in tow. Realizing all too clearly that she had now lost her children as well as her husband, and finding herself abandoned there, alone and destitute, without the slightest notion of how she was going to find them again, she fell in a dead faint on the sand, with the names of her husband and children on her lips. There was nobody at hand to revive her with cold water or other remedies, and hence it was some time before she came to her senses. When eventually the strength returned to her poor, exhausted body, bringing with it further tears and lamentations, she called out over and over again to her children and searched high and low for them in every cavern she could find. But when she saw that her efforts were useless, and that the night was approaching, she began, prompted by an instinctive feeling that all was not entirely lost, to devote some attention to her own predicament. And leaving the shore, she returned to the cave where she was in the habit of giving vent to her tears and sorrow. She had had nothing to eat since midday, and a little after tears, on the following morning, having spent the night in great fear and incredible anguish, she was compelled to start eating grass in order to appease her hunger. Having fed herself on to the best of her ability, she then started brooding tearfully about what was to become of her. And whilst in the midst of these various reflections, she caught sight of a doe, which came towards her and disappeared into a nearby cave, emerging shortly afterwards and then running away into the woods. Getting up from where she was sitting, she entered the cave from which the doe had emerged, and inside she saw 2 newly born roebucks, no more than a few hours old, which seemed to her the sweetest and most charming sight it was possible to imagine. And since her own milk was not yet dry after her recent confinement, she picked them up and tenderly applied them to her breast. They showed no sign of refusing this favor, but took suck from her as though she were their own mother. And from then on, they made no distinction between their mother and herself. Thus, the lady felt she had found some company on this deserted island, and having become just as familiar with the doe as with the 2 roebucks, she resolved to remain there for the rest of her days on a diet of grass and water, bursting into tears whenever she remembered her past life with her husband and children. As a result of leading this sort of life, the gentlewoman had turned quite wild when a few months later a small peasant ship happened to be driven in by a storm, casting anchor in the same little bay where she herself had arrived, and lying there for several days. Now aboard this ship was a gentleman of the Malaspina family called Corrado, who was returning home from a pilgrimage, which, with his worthy and devoted lady, after visiting all the holy places in the kingdom of Apulia. One day, in order to relieve the monotony of the delay, he went ashore with his wife, some of his servants, and his dogs, and started exploring the island. And not very far from the place where Madonna Beritola was, Corrado's dog began giving chase to the 2 roebucks, which had now grown quite big and were out grazing. Pursued by the dogs, the 2 roebucks ran to the very cave where Madonna Beritola was sheltering. Seeing what was happening, she got up, took hold of a stick, and drove the dogs back. Shortly afterwards, Corrado and his lady, who had been following the dogs, arrived on the scene, and when they saw her standing there all bronzed and emaciated with long and unkempt hair, their astonishment, though much less than her own, was very great indeed. However, after Corrado had complied with their entreaties to call off his dogs, they persuaded her with a good deal of coaxing to tell them who she was and what she was doing there. And she gave them a full account of her past life and all her misfortunes, ending by revealing her fierce determination to stay on the island. On hearing this, Corrado, who had been very well acquainted with Arghetto Capice, wept with compassion and attempted to talk her out of her proud decision, offering to take her back to her home, or alternatively, to honor her as a sister and keep her in his own family, where she could stay until such time as God granted her a kinder fate. However, she would have nothing to do with this proposal, and so he left her with his wife, bidding her to arrange for food to be brought, and since the woman was all in rags, to let her have some of her own clothes to wear. But most important, she was to do all she could to bring her back to the ship. On being left alone with Beritola, Corrado's wife shed countless tears over the lady's misfortune. Then, she had the greatest difficulty, which she had the greatest difficulty in persuading her to accept. Oh, sorry. Skipped a line. On being left alone with Beritola, Corrado's wife shed countless tears over the lady's misfortune. Then she gave instructions for food and clothes to be brought, which she had the greatest difficulty in persuading her to accept. And finally, after a stream of entreaties, which Madonna Beritola, asserting that on no account would she go any place in which she was known, she persuaded her to accompany them to Lunigiana, bringing with her the doe and the 2 roebucks. The doe had meanwhile, in fact, returned, and to no small astonishment to Corrado's wife, it had greeted Beritola with a display of affection. And so once the weather had improved, Madonna Beritola embarked on the ship with Corrado and his lady, taking with her the doe and the 2 roebucks, a circumstance which, since few people knew her real name, led to her being referred to as Cavriola. The winds were favorable, and they soon reached the mouth of the river Magra, where they left the ship and proceeded to Corrado's estate in the hills. After her arrival at the castle, Madonna Beritola, dressed in widow's weeds, began to live a humble, secluded, and obedient life as a maid of honor to Corrado's lady, at the same time continuing to treat her roebucks with affection and ensuring that they were properly fed. Meanwhile, the pirates who had unwittingly abandoned Madonna Beritola on Ponza and seizing the ship on which she had been traveling, had arrived at Genoa with all their captives. When the spoils were divided between the owners of the galley, it turned out that Madonna Beritola's nurse and the 2 children were assigned, along with a quantity of goods, to a certain Messer Gasparino di Oria, who sent the woman and the 2 boys to his house with the intention of employing them as slaves on household duties. Being exceedingly distressed by the loss of her mistress, and by the sorry state to which she saw herself and the 2 children reduced, the nurse wept over and over again. But she was a sensible and prudent woman, despite her lowly station in life, and once she had realized that her tears were not going to help in freeing them all from slavery, she did all she could to comfort the children. Considering where they were, she thought it quite possible that the 2 boys would be molested if their identities were discovered. And moreover, she was hoping that sooner or later their luck would change, in which case, provided that they were still alive, the children might regain the positions of honor they had lost. So she resolved not to tell anybody who they were until a suitable occasion presented itself, and meanwhile, whenever she was questioned on the matter, she would claim that the children were her own, renaming the older boy Gianotto de Procida instead of Gisfredi, and leaving the younger boy's name unaltered. She explained very carefully to Gisfredi why she had changed his name and how dangerous it might be for him if he were recognized. And she drummed this into him so often and with so much persistence that, being an intelligent boy, he followed the instruction of his wise nurse to the letter. And so the 2 boys and their nurse, badly clothed and worse shod, continued for many years in Messer Gasparino's house, patiently performing all the most menial tasks it is possible to imagine. But Gianotto was made of sterner stuff than slaves are made of, and by the time he was 16, the baseness of a servile existence had become so repugnant to him that he abandoned Messer Gasparino's household and enlisted as a seaman on galleys plying between Genoa and Alexandria, after which he traveled far and wide without, however, finding a single opportunity for advancement. Finally, when he had almost lost hope of a change of fortune, his wanderings led him to Lunigiana, where he chanced to enter the service of Corrado Malespina, whom he attended to the latter's no small satisfaction, with considerable efficiency. It was now some 3 or 4 years since his departure from Messer Gasparino's, and he had grown into a well-built, handsome young man. He had meanwhile heard that his father, whom he had supposed to be dead, was still alive, but languishing under heavy guard in one of King Charles's dungeons. And whilst he occasionally saw his mother, who was in attendance of Corrado's lady, he never recognized her, nor she him, for they had both changed a great deal in the period that had elapsed since they had last seen one another. Now, whilst Giannotto was in Corrado's service, it happened that a daughter of Corrado's, whose name was Spina, was left a widow by a certain Niccolo di Grenano, and returning to her father's house, being a beautiful and very graceful girl of little more than 16, she began to take an interest in Giannotto, and he in her, with the result that they fell madly in love with one another. Their love was soon consummated, and since it continued for several months undetected, they became excessively confident and were less cautious than they should have been. And one day, while out walking in a fine, thickly wooded forest, Giannotto and the girl, forging on ahead of their companions, came to a delectable spot all covered with grass and flowers and surrounded by trees, and thinking they had left the others far behind, they began to make love. So great was their enjoyment that they lost all track of time, and they had been together for ages when the girl's mother arrived on the scene, to be followed a moment later by Corrado. Dismayed beyond measure by what he saw, he ordered 3 of his servants, without giving any reason, to seize the pair of them, bind them, and march them off to one of his castles. Then he stalked away, seething with distress and anger, and intent on having them ignominiously put to death. The girl's mother was extremely upset and regarded no punishment as too severe for her daughter's lapse, but she could not stand passively aside and allow them to suffer the kind of fate which, on piecing together certain of Corrado's remarks, she realized he was intending to inflict upon the culprits. So she hurried to catch up with her irate husband and began pleading with him not to ruin his old age by killing his own daughter in a sudden fit of frenzy and soiling his hands with the blood of one of his servants. He could, she insisted, find some other way of placating his anger, such as having them incarcerated, so that, as they languished in prison, they would have a chance of repentance in full for their sinful behavior. The saintly woman pressed these views and many others upon him with so much urgency that she dissuaded him from killing them, and he ordered each of them to be imprisoned in different places, where they were to be closely guarded, receive a minimum of food, and suffer the maximum of discomfort until such time as he decided otherwise. These instructions were promptly carried out, and I leave you to imagine the sort of life they led in their captivity, weeping incessantly and almost starving to death. Now, when Giannotto and Spina had been languishing in these wretched conditions for more than 12 months, and Corrado had dismissed them from his thoughts, it came about that King Peter of Aragon, with the aid of a subversive movement led by Messer Gian di Procida, stirred up a rebellion in Sicily and wrested the island from King Charles. Corrado, being a Ghibelline, was overjoyed at the news, and when Giannotto heard about it from one of his jailers, he heaved a deep sigh and said, "Oh, at last, for 14 long years I have traveled the world in continual hardship, waiting only for this to happen. And now that it has come about, just to prove the vanity of all my hopes, I find myself here in this prison cell without the slightest prospect of being released until the day I die." "What are you talking about?" said the jailer. "Surely the affairs of mighty monarchs are no concern of yours. What was your business in Sicily?" "It almost breaks my heart," said Giannotto, "when I recall the business of my father, for although I was still a small boy when I fled the island, yet I remember seeing him as its governor when King Manfred was alive." "And who was this father of yours?" said the jailer. My father's name, said Giannotto, can now be safely revealed, since I no longer have anything to fear from its disclosure. He was called, and if he is still alive, he is still called, Arigetto Capice. And my own name is not Giannotto, but Gisfredi. Furthermore, I have not the slightest doubt that if I were a free man, I could return to Sicily and occupy even now a position of highest importance. The good man asked no more questions, but at the first opportunity he referred the whole matter to Corrado, and although he was listening, Corrado put on some show of indifference. For the jailer's benefit, he went straight to Madonna Beritola and asked her, in a pleasant manner, whether she and Arigetto had ever had a son called Gisfredi. Bursting into tears, the woman replied that if the older of her two sons was still alive, this indeed would be his name, and that he would now be 22 years old. On hearing this, Corrado concluded that the young man must be telling the truth, and it occurred to him that in this case he was in a position to perform an act of clemency that would repair both his own and his daughter's honor, namely to offer him to her in marriage. He arranged a secret interview with Giannotto, in the course of which he interrogated him in detail on the whole of his past life, and having confirmed beyond any doubt that he was indeed Gisfredi, the son of Arigetto Capice, he said, Giannotto, you are aware how great an injury you have done to me in the person of my own daughter. I treated you as a friend, and it was your duty, as my servant, never to do anything that would undermine my honor, or that of my family. Many another man in my place would have had you ignominiously put to death, but I could not bring myself to do such a thing. Now, since what you say is true, and you are a man of gentle birth, I desire, with your consent, to put an end to your suffering and release you from your wretched captive existence, at the same time restoring both your own reputation and mine. As you are aware, my daughter Spina, for whom you form so loving but improper an attachment, is a widow, and she is a good large dowry. You are acquainted with her ways, and with her father and mother. Of your own present condition I say nothing. Therefore, if you are agreeable, I am willing to convert a dishonorable friendship into an honorable marriage, and allow you to live with her in my house for as long as you wish to remain, as though you were my own son. Giannotto's fine physique had been wasted away by his imprisonment, but the innate nobility of his spirit was in no way impaired, and he still loved his lady as wholeheartedly as ever, so that, although he found himself in the other man's power, and wished for nothing better than what Corrado was proposing, he had not the slightest hesitation in following the promptings of his noble heart. Corrado, he replied, neither the lust for power, nor the desire for riches, nor any other motive has ever led me to harbor treacherous designs against your person or property. I loved your daughter, I love her still, and I always shall love her, because I consider her a worthy object of my love, and if, in wooing her, I was acting in a manner that would commonly be regarded as dishonorable, the fault I committed was one which is inseparable from youth. In order to eradicate it, one would have to do away with youth altogether. Besides, it would not be considered half so serious as you and many others maintain if old men would remember that they were once young, and if they would measure other people's shortcomings against their own, and vice versa. I committed this fault not as your enemy, but as your friend. It has always been my wish to do what you are now proposing, and if I had thought your consent would be forthcoming, I would have asked you long ago for your daughter's hand. Coming at this moment, when my expectations were at such a low ebb, your consent is all the more gratifying to me. But if your intentions do not match your words, please do not feed me with vain hopes. Send me back to my prison, and have me treated as cruelly as you like. Whatever you do to me, I shall always love Spina, and for her sake, I shall always love and respect her father. Corrado listened in amazement to Giannotto's words, which convinced him of both his courage and the warmth of his love. Increasing his esteem for the young man, he therefore rose to his feet, embraced and kissed him, and gave orders without further ado for Spina to be brought there in secret. She had turned all pale and weak in prison, and like Giannotto, she almost seemed another person, as in Corrado's presence and by mutual consent they took the marriage vows according to our custom. A few days later, having kept the whole matter secret and providing them with everything they could possibly need or desire, he decided it was time to break the glad tidings to their respective mothers, and summoning his lady and Cavriola, he turned to the latter and said, "What would you say, my lady, if I were to arrange for your elder son to be restored to you, as the husband of one of my daughters?" "The only thing I could say," replied Cavriola, "would be that if it were possible for me to be more obliged to you than I am already, then inasmuch as you would be giving me something I value more than my own life, my debt would be correspondingly large, and by restoring him to me in the way you describe, you would in some measure be rekindling my lost hopes." She then stopped and burst into tears, and Corrado turned to his lady, saying, "And what would you say, my dear, if I were to present you with such a son-in-law?" "If it was pleasing to you," the lady replied, "I would not object to a vagrant for a son-in-law, let alone a man who is of noble birth." "Within a few days," said Corrado, "I hope to have good news for you both." Meanwhile, the two young people were gradually putting flesh on their bones, and when Corrado saw that they had quite recovered, he had them dressed in fine clothes and returned to Gisfredi, saying, "Would it not add greatly to your happiness to see your mother in this place?" "My mother suffered such appalling misfortunes," replied Gisfredi, "that I cannot believe she has survived them. But if she has, I would be very glad indeed to see her, for with her advice I believe I could largely repair my fortunes in Sicily." Corrado then summoned the two ladies, and they both smothered the new bride with affection, at the same time wondering what had happened to soften Corrado's heart to the extent of uniting her in wedlock with Giannotto. With Corrado's words fresh in her memory, Madonna Beritola had meanwhile begun to stare intently at the young man. Suddenly, some occult force stirred within her, causing her to recollect the boyish features of her own son's face, and without awaiting further proof of his identity, she rushed toward him and flung her arms about his neck. Her feelings of maternal joy and affection were so intense that she was unable to utter a word. On the contrary, she lost all power of her five senses and collapsed in the arm of her son, as though she were dead. Giannotto, for his part, was filled with amazement, for he couldn't remember having seen her on many previous occasions in the same castle without ever having recognized her. Nevertheless, he now knew instinctively that she was his mother, and bursting into tears, reproaching himself for his former indifference, he received her in his arms and kissed her with tenderness. Shortly afterwards, with the loving assistance of Spina and Corrado's lady, who applied cold water and other remedies to Madonna Beritola, Madonna Beritola recovered her senses and embraced her son all over again, weeping copiously and uttering a stream of gentle endearments, and giving vent to her maternal affection. She kissed him 1,000 times or more, whilst he held her in his arms and gazed at her in awe and reverence. When the chaste and joyful greetings had been repeated 3 or 4 times, to no small pleasure and approval of the onlookers, the mother and son had exchanged the story of their adventures. Gisfredi turned to Corrado, who, having already informed his friends about the marriage and receiving their delighted approval, had given orders for a sumptuous and splendid banquet, and he said, "Corrado, you have bestowed many favors upon me, and you have long sheltered my mother under your roof. But so that we may use your good offices to full, I now want to ask you to gladden my mother, my wedding feast, and myself by sending for my brother. As I have told you already, he and I were seized by pirates acting for Messer Gasparino de Oria, who is detaining him in his house in the role of a servant. And I would also like you to send somebody to Sicily who can bring us a clear picture of the conditions there and tell us whether my father, Aragetto, is alive or dead, and whether if he is still alive, he is in good health. Gisfredi's request was well received by Corrado, who immediately sent experienced couriers to Genoa and Sicily. The one who went to Genoa called Messer Gasparino and earnestly entreated him on Corrado's behalf to send him the outcast and his nurse, giving him a concise account of what Corrado had done for Gisfredi and his mother. "It is true," said Messer Gasparino, who was greatly astonished by this tale, "that I would do anything in my power to please Corrado. And for the past 14 years, the boys you mentioned and his mother have certainly been under my roof, and I will gladly send them to him, but you are to warn him from me not to pay too much attention to the tall stories of Gianotto, who now masquerades, if I understand you aright, under the name of Gisfredi. That young man is much more cunning than Corrado seems to realize." He said no more, but having attended to the good man's lodging, he secretly sent for the nurse and questioned her closely on the subject. She had already heard about the rebellion in Sicily, and on learning that Aragetto was alive, she abandoned her former fear and told him the whole story, explaining her reasons for her actions that she had taken. On finding that the nurse's account corresponded exactly with that of Corrado's emissary, Messer Gasparino began to take her more seriously. Being a very astute man, he took various steps to have it thoroughly checked, becoming more and more convinced of its veracity with every scrap of new evidence he discovered. Ashamed at having treated the boy so contemptuously, he made amends by bestowing a wife on him in the person of his pretty little 11-year-old daughter. Different times. Together with a huge dowry, for he was well aware of Aragetto's past and present fame, after celebrating the event in great style, he embarked, along with the youth, his daughter, Corrado's emissary, and the nurse, on a well-armed galliot, and sailed to Larisi, where he was met by Corrado. Then, with the whole of his company, he proceeded to one of Corrado's castles, not very far from there, where the great wedding feast was about to be held. The general rejoicing, whether that was of the mother on seeing her son again, or of the two brothers, or that which all three greeted the faithful nurse, or that displayed by everyone towards Messer Gasparino and his daughter, and vice versa, or that of the whole company in the presence of Corrado, his lady, his children, and his friends, would be impossible to describe in words. And thus I leave it, ladies, to your imagination. But to crown it all, the Lord God, whose generosity knows no bounds once it is set in motion, arranged things so that the news should arrive that Aragetto was alive and in good health. For amid the great rejoicing, when the guests, men and women, were still seated round the tables, having proceeded no further than the first course, Corrado's other emissary returned from Sicily. Amongst other things, he narrated how Aragetto had been held prisoner in Catania on the orders of King Charles, and how, after the country's insurrection against the king, the people had stormed the prison, killing his jailers and setting him free. Since he was King Charles's bitterest opponent, they had then elected him their leader and joined him in pursuing and killing the French. For this reason, he had achieved a high reputation in the eyes of King Peter, who had reinstated him in all his possessions and titles, and so he now enjoyed a position of great honor and authority. The messenger added that Aragetto had welcomed him very warmly, being overjoyed beyond description to hear about his wife and son, of whom he had received no news since the time of his capture. He was, in fact, sending a brigantine with some gentlemen aboard to come and fetch them, and they were due to arrive at any moment. The envoy's announcement was greeted with prolonged cheering and rejoicing, and Corrado promptly went out with some of his friends to meet the gentlemen who were coming to fetch Madonna Beritola and Gisfredi, and after giving them a hearty welcome, he took them in to his banquet, less than half of which had so far been served. Such was the delight of Beritola, Gisfredi, and all the others, on seeing them, that they almost raised the roof with their greeting. But before sitting down to eat, the Sicilians conveyed Arigetto's warmest greeting and deepest thanks to Corrado and his lady for the hospitality they had offered to his wife and son, and pledged his readiness to assist them in any way within his power. They then turned to Messer Gasparino, whose courteous action had taken them by surprise, and said that they were quite certain that when Arigetto came to know of the generous settlement he had made on the outcast, he would be just as grateful to him as he was to Corrado, or possibly even more so. Then, without further ado, they turned with great gusto to the business of feasting the two brides and their respective bridegrooms. Corrado's entertainment of his son-in-law and his other friends and relatives was not confined to that day alone, but extended over many of the days that followed. When the feasting was over, and Madonna Beritola, Gisfredi, and the others felt that the time had come for their departure, they went aboard the brig, taking Spina with them, and to the accompaniment of copious tears, they took their leave of Corrado, his wife, and Messer Gasparino. The winds being favorable, they soon reached Sicily, and on their arrival at Palermo, they were all, the two sons and the womenfolk, alike greeted by Arigetto with a warmth that beggars description. There it is believed that they all lived long and happily, at peace with the Almighty, and grateful for the blessing he had bestowed upon them. And I hope you've enjoyed that. Bye-bye. By the way, the story's not true, but anyway.